the question is, should you? Right? Should you? That's the question. So the ethics discusses what you should do and not what you can do. Right? Ethics discuss what you should do, not what you can do. So can the world account for martyrdom? Right? Can people take their life? Obviously, people can for the better cause. What Mill says is that you should not do that. Right? It's not the case of whether you have the ability to do it as much as it is the case, well, should you do it? And Mill says that men can do it, but that they should not do it. Okay. Now, he adds to this argument, right, in a very interesting way. And what he does is, despite the fact that men should not take their own lives, right, despite the fact that he says on a utilitarian ground that men should not take their own lives, here's what he says, and this is a direct quote. Quote, "The readiness to make such a sacrifice is the highest virtue which can be found in a man." Right? And I would really love to hear what people think about that claim, especially in the contemporary sense, right? I'll read this again. This is a direct quote. He says, quote, "The readiness to make such a sacrifice," the sacrifice of, losing my own life for the betterment of others. That's the only condition that he's talking about, not for increasing further martyrdom, but for the betterment of others. I'm going to sacrifice my life to make the next generation's life, or even my current generation's lives, that much better. The readiness to make such a sacrifice is the highest virtue which can be found in a man, right? Sacrifice, ultimate sacrifice, sacrifice for a greater cause, for the greater good, is the highest virtue. And I wonder what people have to say about that. It would be interesting, right? Sacrifice for the greater good is the highest virtue. Sacrifice for the greatest good is the highest virtue. Well, that's pretty interesting. All right, the next thing is to recognize that, according to Mill, it is consistent with utilitarian morality to conclude that one may sacrifice their own greatest good for the happiness of others. It is consistent. There is no contradiction in that, right? So it would be incorrect to say that, according to utilitarian ethic, it is immoral for an individual agent to sacrifice his or her life for the greater good. That's false. Mill says, and has said, that that's the greatest good attainable, right? That level of sacrifice is the greatest sacrifice that one could be made. I'm going to sacrifice myself for the good of others, so that it is consistent with utilitarian morality to make such sacrifice. Then, lastly, within this discussion of sacrifice, and I mean, I'm just personally interested in sort of the idea of sacrifice and how we make sense of sacrifice with respect to ethics. Sacrifice that does not contribute, now here's the important part, sacrifice that does not contribute, and I've already addressed this, to increasing the greatest happiness of all, and only for oneself, is wasted. He said it's a waste, right? You've wasted that which can contribute to the greatest virtue, right? The highest virtue. Self-sacrifice for the betterment of others is the highest virtue. Self-sacrifice just for one's own self, for one's own sort of remorseful life, is completely wasted, according to John Stuart Mill. So that John Stuart Mill, in a utilitarian ethic, would look more favorably on the martyr than he would, and not he as a person, but than the system would view an act of just general suicide because of sort of an apathetic approach to life or an apathetic view of life. Killing oneself from apathy is wasted, according to utilitarian ethic, than killing oneself to make a statement, to martyr oneself, to increase the likelihood that fellow brothers and sisters would have a better life. So I mean, that's a very, especially now, in, you know, with respect to sort of post World War I, World War II, with kamikaze and suicide bombers, it would be really interesting to see what that discussion is and how theorists either account for that or disavow that sort of claim by Mill. It'd be interesting to see how that turns out. Let me just take this time really quick. I don't know how much time I got. Okay. The next thing, so Mill has addressed sort of this idea of sacrifice. The next thing to discuss is sort of the idea that utilitarianism becomes a burden, right? It becomes a heavy system for me to have to live by, right? We all know that all systems of morality attempt to govern human behavior, right? They tell you what you ought to do, what you should not do, what you ought not to do, what you must do, what you have to do, what you must not do. This is what ethics does. But this particular system, some might say, some objector might say, look, Mill, this is just too much. It's too heavy a burden for me to have to live my life thinking about, especially after the claim on sacrifice, that it's all about, you know, the collective happiness of other individuals. What about my own happiness? So Mill has to address some of these, right? So this is Mill on the burden of utilitarianism. This is Mill, John Stuart Mill on the burden, and that's the best way I could phrase it, the burden of utilitarianism. The first point to recognize is that no system of ethics requires that the sole motive governing our action arises from a feeling of duty. No system of ethics requires that the only motive for governing our action arise from duty. Right? So the claim is that the agent or the agent should act in accordance with his or her duty, right? The agent should act in accordance with his or her duty, right? Where does that duty come from? Well, that duty comes from conforming to the GHP, right? I have a duty to conform to the GHP. But Mill says, well, no, that's not quite right? That's not what I'm saying. And there's a deeper level of this that I can't go in sort of this introductory account. And the level is this. In Kantian terms, Kant has what's known as a deontological ethic, right? An ethic of obligations, right? And that the prescriptions made in a Kantian deontological ethic are immediately universalizable, right? They're maxims that I have to conform to, right? I always, at all times in my actions, have to act in such a manner that it would increase the lot of everyone else's act. And I mean, there's better accounts of making Kant's, but I'm not going to get into that, right? There's an obligation that I have under a deontological ethic to act in accordance with the law, right? I have to act in accordance with the law. What I do has to be done in conforming to the law, otherwise my action is immoral. Even if my intention is not to necessarily do good or do bad, if I make an action and the purpose that's motivating my action isn't conforming with the law, then my action is wrong. And Mill's like, listen, that doesn't make any sense, right? That's not what I'm arguing. I'm not arguing for this sort of deontological ethic. And he gives some pretty interesting responses to this.